Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFR Let's Talk. And today we have with us Thierry Carrez, General Manager of Open Infra Foundation. Thierry, it's great to have you on the show.
Oh, it's great to be with you all today, and thank you for the invitation.
It's my pleasure to host you here. I've been covering Open Infra from OpenStack Foundation days. A lot of great memories there, and the way the foundation is evolving is also great. We are talking about Dalmatian, which is like 30th release, and soon we'll be also talking about your 15th anniversary. So a lot to talk about today. If you look at the old days of Open Infra or OpenStack, and today a lot has changed. A lot of new technologies have emerged. So I want to understand a bit about Foundation, OpenStack project. You have a lot of adjacent projects. In the back days, you used to call them adjacent. So I want to understand the whole picture of where the foundation is today, where the projects are.
Sure. So the Open Infra Foundation started as the OpenStack Foundation. Like you said, it was our original project. The mission of the foundation is really to create communities that build open source software that is used for running infrastructure. And this mission brought us beyond just OpenStack. So now we support the OpenStack project still, obviously, but also Kata containers, Zuul, CI, Starling X. Those are all projects that help with running infrastructure securely and in production. So that's why we've gone beyond our roots around OpenStack and are now called the Open Infra Foundation.
When we look at, I remember the early days, when OpenStack was the shiny object in the room. And sometimes we do get attracted towards the shiny objects, but then technologies mature, they become stable, and we want them to become boring. So like Linux kernel, Kubernetes, or OpenStack, Unix, mainframe, these are not obsolete or ancient technologies. These technologies are kind of, you can say, the backbone of our economy or our industry. Every transaction we make goes through some mainframe. The same is the case with OpenStack and other Open Infra Foundation projects. So can you talk about how you have seen the evolution and what is still driving the adoption of your projects?
Sure. So what we've seen is that OpenStack has become really a trusted part of open source software you can run to provide infrastructure today. So it's combined with obviously the Linux kernel, but also Kubernetes running on top of OpenStack. So if you combine all of those things, you basically have an end-to-end open source solution for providing infrastructure. And so that's been great to see. And what we've seen lately, you mentioned the growth in interest. Obviously, we always had a lot of users and they're continuing to grow their footprint, but we are seeing new users joining and installing OpenStack over the last few years and this year in particular. And that's like, we have observed four main drivers for this resurgence in interest. The first one is digital sovereignty. A lot of people in a lot of countries are really afraid of the geopolitical situation. They want to have more control on critical infrastructure. And therefore, we're seeing a lot of companies, a lot of governments setting up new infrastructure locally and not really necessarily relying on hyperscalers to provide it for them anymore. And so that's been a big driver for adoption for OpenStack, obviously. There is another relatively new trend that's driven through the changes in licensing around VMware. As you probably are very aware, Broadcom has changed the rules in licensing for VMware, and that has really created a lot of uncertainty in the market for those VMware users. So they've been starting to look for alternatives. And one of those alternatives is to embrace a more radical cloud transformation and deploy some internal capacity in the capacity of private clouds. And those are flocking towards OpenStack as well. Obviously, there are other types of concerns. I would say security concerns around infrastructure are also an all-time high. And so that drives adoption of Kata containers and OpenStack in our case. And finally, as you're probably aware that AI is changing the world right now. And so there's a lot of demand for new accelerated infrastructure to be able to train those models to get to the next stage of AI capabilities. And so that also drives a lot of adoption, because once you get your hands on those GPUs, you want to have software to make them available for your users as often and at full capacity as possible. And that really drives people towards just using what's available on the shelf, open source software that you can just take and run for driving that infrastructure. And so we are seeing lots of new data centers being built, lots of new companies being formed, and a lot of them are relying on OpenStack to get the software part of the equation done.
Can you also talk about, if possible, some new use cases, either new organizations, where even you're surprised that the scale at which they are using OpenStack and other open infra technologies?
OpenStack has always been really used in a lot of cases in telecommunications. So, for example, we've seen most of the telco operators around the world are really using OpenStack for their core backbone. And so that's always been there. We've always seen a lot of adoption for OpenStack in research and high performance computing as well. So those were always there. But what we've seen lately is more interest in using OpenStack in banking and insurance, like more for financial applications. So, for example, all of the top 8 banks in France are all deploying OpenStack and using OpenStack in some capacity. We've seen the American insurer Geico also be deploying OpenStack, a relatively recent deployment. So it's a relatively new user, and we're seeing them deploying OpenStack as well. So finance is, I guess, one key new sector that we've seen that always been using OpenStack in some capacity, but right now we're really seeing a ramp up in adoption in the finance industry.
As you mentioned, the Broadcom acquisition of VMware and the change, we are seeing this trend recently. HashiCorp was example, Redis was example, where open source communities reacted, responded, and created a fork. It is becoming kind of a global problem at some point, and also, if you look at Europe, CRA, Cyber Resiliency Act, which was good intentions there, but the implementation was not great. Can you also talk about some of the disturbing trends that you are seeing in the open source space that has you folks worried? Because you folks don't just host, open source software stack. You also play a role in creating, kind of even playing field for open source communities and projects as well. So how do you look at these trends, and what is Open Infra Foundation doing to address some of these problems?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We've seen, like you said, licensing changes across a number of open source vendors. That's created a lot of uncertainty for the industry because you invest in software, you want it to be around under the same conditions without changing. And so what we're seeing, what we are doing as a foundation to help with that is encourage adoption of open source that's driven by a community, not just one single company, so that the terms cannot be unilaterally changed by one single party, and that gives you a lot more certainty about the future of the software you're investing a lot of resources on. So it's especially important for infrastructure software because the investment is so massive there. You can't really afford to, you used to be able to afford to trust a company like VMware to not change completely their licensing terms in the course of a very short period. But today we've seen in proprietary software, in open source software, a lot of those drastic changes, and that means there is a lot more interest in software that's built by a global community under the auspices of a foundation, especially in the infrastructure realm. So that makes the Open Infra Foundation more relevant than ever. And there is this other point that you raised around regulation, which I think is the downside of success. Open source is now sufficiently obvious and successful that you can't really not be really regulated. Like it is part of any type of software, and so regulation is coming for software in general and open source in particular. And so we need to be ready for that. We need to track those regulations. We need to make sure they don't destroy innovation in the process in the process of starting to regulate liability or the rules of security. If you put a product out there that you're supposed to provide fixes in case of security issues, those are all really good ideas. We just need to make sure that in the process of rolling out those regulations, we don't destroy the how open source software is built by communities, not just a single company, and take into account the uniqueness of our processes, the fact that it is very open. So you don't really put a product out there. It's built in the open, so you can see it being built. All of those things make it super important for the open source communities to be involved in the drafting of those regulations. And as a foundation, we get involved in those discussion groups, those work groups, to make sure that our voice is heard by the regulators, which are always well-intentioned, but sometimes badly informed.
Yeah, I mean, that's the case. The intentions are good, but it's more collaboration is needed between the policymaker, decision maker, lawmaker, because they understand the law side of it, they understand the problem side of it, but they don't understand the technology side of it. So sometimes they have good intentions, but not good implementation. So yes, more collaboration is needed. Thank you for that. Now let's just switch gears and talk about this Dalmatian release. Can you also talk about, based on our discussion where we have seen the evolution of the project, the evolution of the market, new use cases, talk a bit about what leads to this release, what are the new features, functionalities that were added to once again cater to some of these new use cases, new demands, new requests.
So new features in OpenStack land because there are new use cases that are required. At this point, the software is pretty stable. It does a really good job at doing what it does, but there are new workloads coming out or new hardware to be taken advantage of, and that's really what's driving new changes in the software beyond just making sure that it continues to work well with the Linux kernel, with KVM, the virtualization systems, with new versions of hardware that's coming out. The new features will always be around new types of hardware that you need to be able to connect, or some types of workload that brings new requirements on the APIs, and we need to create new functions basically. And so we do releases every 6 months. So sometimes there are like more features, sometimes it's more about stability and fixes and security bugs being fixed. But in this release, what we've seen is some of those trends that I mentioned earlier, with like the infrastructure for AI, or the concerns around security, or I would say a demand for more streamlined user experience coming from VMware. You're really used to a very polished UI experience, and you jump to something that's mostly driven through APIs, which is a bit of a significant jump if you're used to a very polished UI. And so we need to bridge that gap and make sure that our user interfaces, our user experience is as good as one that for someone that would be coming from a VMware background. So we're seeing all of those trends being reflected in new features that have landed in this release. We had about 500 contributors contributing patches over the past 6 months for making this release happen, and the end result is this release that's come out about 2 weeks ago now.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And also congratulations on the release. Now, I also want to dig into some of the, either features or improvement, which is also based on the trends that you were seeing in the market. And right now, the hottest trend is AI, especially Gen AI. AI has been around for decades, Gen AI is the one that is getting all the hype and buzzword. Running AI workloads is itself challenging right. So talk a bit about how is OpenStack and how is Dalmatian kind of evolved to support these emerging workloads, because the fact is that new technologies keep coming in and we have to accommodate users so that they are able to run on their own private clouds. So talk a bit about, let's just focus on AI for a bit and talk about the improvements or functionalities that are added to the mission.
Sure. So for AI, I would say the main concern is to make sure that you support the latest and greatest GPUs and vGPUs. NVIDIA is coming up with new ways of slicing those expensive pieces of hardware so that multiple users can use them at the same time. And so we need to catch up with making sure that we support the latest ways of slicing and connecting to those vGPUs. That's been done in previous releases mostly. So I would say that feature set is pretty much there. In Dalmatian, what we've seen is more like secondary type features. Like we have a reservation service called Blazar, and this allows you to reserve instances ahead of time, and making sure that you can use those GPU powered instances to the full extent of that you can occupy them 100% of the time is super critical. You've made a very large investment to buy those GPUs. And so you want to make sure they are used 100% of the time. And so reservation is one way to make sure that you grab the instances that have those GPUs really as fast as possible. And Blazar has grown the ability to book those instances based on flavors, which can indicate if the VM you're getting is connected to a GPU or not. So it used to be more difficult to reserve instances for an AI workload before, and now Blazar has closed that gap that was there for reserving specific flavors of instances. We're seeing other types of small adjustment like that in Nova, which is our main compute VM service. You get the ability to persist vGPU attachments across physical reboots of the host, which means that you can get back the vGPUs that you were using before without having to redo all the attachment procedures and all of those costly, time-consuming interactions to make sure that you get the same vGPU after a reboot. So those things are really corner cases, but making sure that you get the most juice out of your investment in those GPUs, because that's clearly what's driving the industry right now is availability of those GPUs and making sure that you can use them as much as possible and to the full 100% of the time they are completely used, because otherwise you start losing money really fast. So those are the two features that we've tracked linked to new AI use cases that have landed in this release.
And let's also talk about security, because security, we have talked about it so much that it's no longer an afterthought. It's moving in developers' pipeline. A lot of movements are happening. What is this release doing to make it easier for developers and, of course, security teams, DevOps, CISOs to fully trust it and not worry about security at all?
Sure. So those again are incremental improvements. The OpenStack releases before were already very have developed very extensive security features, but they're like other always improvement you can make to reduce your attack surface or to reduce the exposure of confidential information. And what we've seen in Dalmatian is some work being done in Ironic, which is our bare metal provisioning service, to reduce what's exposed to bare metal host during cleanup operations, during rescue operations. So making sure that the rescue passwords are not stored unencrypted anywhere, making sure that the nodes when you're cleaning them up are free of any confidential information. Those are all very small improvements. You can also, in Ironic, you can also now patch a firmware of a host without putting it in pause. So you can have an active host and patch the firmware, which really facilitates passing security patches on the firmware, because if you have to wait for a moment where the host is rebooted, that reduces your options for passing those patches. And now Ironic can patch a firmware on an active node, which lets you gain some time and practicality. But beyond Ironic, we've seen Neutron improving the role-based access control, much more fine-grained, so you can have finer permission sets that's given to every user. Nova has grown the ability to use virtual TPMs, software-based TPMs that run on the machine, and give VMs access to that VTPM where secrets can be stored. So all, again, small use cases, incremental improvement, but that reflects the concerns of the industry for security and take advantage of the latest capabilities in software and hardware.
And as earlier you also mentioned, VMware. We had a long discussion around the license change. Talk a bit about not just from the point of view of enhancement that were made to OpenStack, but also how it's facilitating users to easily migrate or gradually move their workloads to OpenStack.
Migrations of VMs from VMware to OpenStack, there are a number of tools that are available on the market to do that. It's mostly a V2V migration, so you can run a VM on VMware and transfer it completely to OpenStack really easily. And there are tools out there, websites that you can use. You enter your VMware credentials on one side, your OpenStack credentials on the other, and those would do that transition for you. We actually had a VMware working group at the OpenStack Foundation, at the Open Infra Foundation, where our members that are interested in providing solutions for migration got together, and they issued a white paper that is available on the OpenStack.org website to talk about how to facilitate that transition for VMware user to OpenStack. So what are the equivalent services? What are the migration processes you can use? All of those things were really help prospective VMware users to move to OpenStack, and I encourage anyone interested in looking at that to read that white paper that is available on the OpenStack.org website.
Excellent, thank you. Now, I remember the early days of OpenStack. Of course, I always become nostalgic. COVID disrupted a lot of things, but you folks used to also do super user awards. Now it has mostly become regional. So I'm still interested in some of those stories when it comes to user and vendors, because the way they are not only leveraging OpenStack and other open infra technology, but also creating a lot of things is also as exciting as the project itself is. So can you talk about some of those interesting, use cases, stories of users and vendors?
You're right, those stories are always inspiring. And every time I meet a new user, I love to hear about how they use the software. Because one of the weird aspects of open source software is that you can have a lot of users you don't know about. And so every time I learn a new story, I'm excited. We've heard really nice stories over the past year of usage of OpenStack for various corner cases. We touched on Gecko earlier. We touched on the new AI data centers, like NextGen is a top 10 GPU buyer that's built their data centers on OpenStack. So that's a good example. We've seen also in the UK, we've seen the Dawn supercomputer. So the fastest supercomputer in the UK is running OpenStack and is being used to train some AI models as well. And we've seen a new product offering coming from Rackspace, which founded OpenStack a long time ago. So seeing them re-engage really with the community is really great to see. And closer to home, I learned about a well-known charity in France called Les Restos du Cœur, the Restaurants of the Heart, that is basically serving food for anyone in need during the winter period in France. And they've actually deployed OpenStack for their internal organization, the logistics of the operation. And so seeing that, the software you're working on is being built and used by charities to actually deliver more food to the people in need is also a great example that, open infrastructure is great because anyone can take it, anyone can use it for doing anything. And that's really what makes me get up every day and do this work. So I'm very happy to hear more stories.
Thierry, thank you so much for joining me today, and of course, not only talk about the evolution of OpenStack, Open Foundation, all the projects there, but also the role that you folks are playing in the larger open source ecosystem. So thanks for all those great insights. Also, thanks for sharing all these, user stories. So it was really great, and I would love to have you back on the show to discuss more about what you folks are doing at Open Infra Foundation. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me, Swapnil, and I'll be back with pleasure.